Hello and welcome to Shaka Extra Time. I am Paul Ndiho, and joining me on set is Shaka Sali himself, aka the Kabale Kid. Hello, Shaka.
Hello, Paul.
How are you?
Hugely terrific.
Great. It's another exciting week, and a warm welcome to you all, our Facebook followers watching us live here from Washington. Shaka Extra Time is a place where you get to ask Shaka some questions. Shaka, we have quite an interesting and exciting week ahead of us. Maybe let's begin here in the nation's capital. Nigerian President Buhari was in town. Yesterday he met with President Donald Trump. Maybe bring us up to speed. What did they talk about?
Well, first of all, it was very interesting, of course, to see Nigerian President Muhammadu Buhari at the White House having a meeting with, obviously, perhaps the world's most important political leader, Donald Trump. And frankly, looking at their interaction and what have you, Paul, you have to say that those two individuals seem to have developed a sort of chemistry. They seem to be there for each other, patting each other's back. And it looks like whatever, in fact, was on the plate for Buhari, in as far as what he wanted to get from the United States, he seems to have got it. And I'm talking about the planes, the helicopters, and what have you, the military instructors who are going to be going to Abuja and train or share some of their skills in terms of combating terrorism and what have you.
There was something striking that I noticed while they were having a press conference. There is so much that Nigeria is grappling with right now. You talk about Boko Haram, you talk about corruption, you talk about the upcoming elections in Nigeria where President Muhammadu Buhari is a candidate. Nothing came up during the press conference. What did you get out of that press conference?
Paul, it is very unfortunate because that seems to be rooted, frankly, in the historical way, the traditional way in which American journalists behave, especially when they have to ask questions to visiting dignitaries. And in particular, frankly, I have seen this for several decades in terms of how they interact with African leaders when they're in the nation's capital. It seems as if when you think about the fact that you have these two individuals, you have President Trump, who is a host of a Nigerian president, Buhari, at the White House, 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, a man who represents a country that is very, very strategically important in as far as bring about peace and stability in the world is concerned. You're talking about a Nigeria which probably is anywhere between 180 to 200 million human beings. You're talking about a country that has the largest economy in Africa and all that kind of stuff. And yet, to be very honest with you, these journalists did not seem, frankly, to recognize the fact that he was in front of them. Guess what? The first question was not about Nigeria. It was not about the meeting. It was on domestic issues, talking about the big war. And frankly, even a man like Donald Trump, who happened to be the host, allowed that to go on. The next question was also, frankly, not on Nigeria. As a matter of fact, the other question that seemed to be important seemed to be about Israel and Netanyahu and all that kind of stuff. It was very embarrassing.
So what does that say about African leaders coming to town? Are they relevant? In fact, maybe I can link that to a Facebook comment. Let's go to Moses Lachong in Nigeria, who wants to know, what do you think African leaders have to say in today's international politics?
You see, African leaders are very important when they are in their own countries. In fact, when you look at the manner in which most of them behave, they pretty much like play a role of a sort of semi or demi-god, really. But guess what? The moment they go to their international airports, get on a jet plane, and fly into international boundaries. They cease to have that kind of clout.
Let's cross over to Chad, one of those countries that we rarely cover. Something remarkable has happened or is about to happen, another constitutional change. This is the last time they did that was in 2005. They amended the constitution to remove term limits. It looks like they're going back to where they were before that. Bring us up to speed.
Well, you could probably say that they are making an improvement on what they actually did back in 2005, because to be fair to Idris Deby, who obviously has been in power for very, very many years, they had to open up the constitution, the term limit, so that they could allow him to serve for more than 2 terms. And so he's been serving, and he looks like he's probably getting a little bit older. And so they decided that they have to be a little bit inclusive in terms of who probably may, at the end of the day, become the successor to Idris Deby. He shouldn't break Idris Deby's record. And so at least will in fact be allowed, for example, to be able to run for another 2 terms after he actually completes his, this term basically, which the next election is after 2021. And so they have reimposed the term limits. And guess what? They have also, in fact, increased a single term, which used to be 5 years, now will be 6 years, just like Putin in Russia. And so the fact that they have also reimposed these terms, now 2 terms, does not in any way affect the position or situation of the incumbent president, Deby. It will not be retroactive. And so it is as if, in fact, he's beginning on a new slate. And so he will be entitled to run for another 2 terms. So you're looking at somebody who will be in office up to somewhere of 2033 or something of that sort. By then, by the way, he will be in his evening years. He will be in his 80s and all that kind of stuff. And whoever comes afterwards will obviously be restricted, at least, to having 2 terms, which is 12 years, which of course has a precedence even in Africa. We're talking about Liberia.
Shaka, that's interesting. We seem to be going back to where we were maybe in the 80s, in the 70s. Chad is not setting a precedent here. There are some countries that have done that before. Take, for example, Rwanda has successfully done that. Uganda has done that. If Kabila in Congo had his way, he would do exactly the same thing. Nkurunziza in Burundi is attempting to do the same thing. What went wrong?
It is very interesting because you left out, of course, the one that happens to have the world record. And that is, of course, Theodore Obiang Basongo, the president of Equatorial Guinea. This is the world's longest serving president. He came to power back in 1978. And guess what? He doesn't have any term limits. He's in the mid-70s. So he basically should, in fact, call himself a sort of presidential monarch. Because guess what? Even his son is a vice president. So you already have, in fact, a possible successor to this man. But you see, there have been some countries, of course, which have come up with some arguments. They look at some of these individuals, especially where you come from in Uganda, where Yoweri Museveni happens to be the incumbent president since 1986. This despite the fact that when he first came to power in 1986, he actually was so contemptuous of African leaders who stay long in power. He thought that they were out of their mind if they could in fact stay in power for longer than 10 years. But because he has been in power now for more than 32 years, he begins now to justify, obviously, for being there by saying that because he has actually served long, he has now become an expert at good governance. He has become an expert at being a terrific president, that kind of stuff. And in fact, there is evidence on the ground because his supporters, in fact, say this man happens to be uniquely gifted, so much that he happens, in fact, to be a sort of God's gift politically to Uganda. Uganda cannot do without him. The same thing, in fact, is said by supporters of neighboring Rwanda's president. Major General Paul Kagame, retired but not tired. These are unique individuals, uniquely gifted. In terms of politics, we're talking about human beings, really, who, in a sense, are God's gifts to their countries. This is what they say, and this is how they go about ruling, because there's no democracy in those countries.
How would you respond to critics? For example, a Facebook commenter from Moses, I don't know where he's writing from, but he says that maybe young Africans or Africans in general have become complacent. They have allowed these leaders really to take them for granted, and maybe it's about time they stood up and started these uprisings to get rid of these rulers.
I think Moses has a point, and in fact, he has a point in the sense that when we talk about young people, Paul Ndiho should be, in fact, in a position to count himself among those people. Because, frankly, this is your moment. Yeah. Yeah. This is your moment. You have to assert your rights. Because, frankly, for the most part, your generation is not treated in most African countries, not all of them. Some countries like South Africa, like Botswana, like Namibia, like Ghana, like Mauritius. I can talk about countries probably not more than 15. Yeah, you have people there who obviously happen to be citizens in the sense that they actually owe allegiance to the state, and therefore they have constitutional rights. They have rights in the sense that they actually happen to be in a position to choose their leaders. But for the most part, Paul, most young people like you live in an Africa where you are a subject. You owe allegiance to an individual authority, a presidential monarch, a dictator, in fact, in short, or a king, or an emperor for that matter, and therefore you have no constitutional rights, no inalienable rights, no birthrights, really. You do not have rights, and so you basically can wait for some privileges which have to be granted to you by those presidential monarchs. So you have to do something about it, because let's face it, there's a saying that no society gets a leadership that it desires. Rather, what you get, in fact, is what you deserve. Because the last time I checked, whoever you have as your leader is a reflection of the sum total of who you are.
Just a reminder that you are watching Shaka Extra Time, and Shaka Extra Time is a place where you get to talk to Shaka himself and ask questions. Straight away, let's go back to our social media comments. Let's go to one Arthur Jedberg, who wants to know, where do you see free press being curtailed in most African nations? Is democracy under threat? Maybe I could also tie that to social media. Some countries have come up with very interesting new rules or laws that curtail social media. They want people, for example, in Tanzania, in Uganda, people who use social media like WhatsApp, all these other, if you post anything online, to pay tax on it.
Well, that obviously means that governments, especially those that happen to be democratically challenged, they have to figure out a way of controlling this monster, this uncontrollable monster, which is called social media. Mind you, traditionally African countries have had what they call ministers of information. But when you think about the terrain, the media terrain right now, sincerely, if you are a minister of information, what do you control? What do you manage? You also learn, probably, from the same source as things happen. And so I think this is an effort or an attempt by some of these democratically challenged governments, so better known probably as dictatorships, to control the manner in which people access, or people in which they have unfettered access to this social media, which is the equalizer. It is equalizer in the sense that you pretty much get to know what is happening in your neighborhood, in your region, and beyond pretty much at the same time. I think that's really what is happening because, hey, let's face it, you know, there used to be a saying that all you have to do really, and especially this is something that advanced by dictators or people who happen to be rulers who are not accountable to their constituents, who are not transparent in the manner in which they do things, who do not really have integrity in the eyes of their people. So they would say, you do not need democracy. Can you eat democracy? What you need is food on the table. What you need is road. You need infrastructure and kind of stuff. So the key here is all you need is social, they call it service delivery. As if in fact service delivery and democracy are mutually exclusive. On the contrary, they are mutually reinforcing actually. You know, President Barack Obama at one time, I recall saying that even with prosperity, without freedoms, such as freedoms of expression, freedom of association, freedom of worship, you know, those types of freedom, without it, he said, it is a fundamental form of poverty.
Interesting. Speaking about presidents, let's go to one of your favorite quotes from Abraham Lincoln. Democracy is a government of the people, by the people, for the people, right? It seems in Africa, in our context here, we are looking at two forms of democracies. We have a democracy, as you like to define it, of some people, by some people.
For some people. As
opposed to the real democracy. Maybe help us understand the definition, the true definition of democracy.
Wait a minute. Democracy is an equal opportunity employer. Democracy belongs to all of us. Another way of putting it, democracy sincerely is the presence or a reflection of social economic justice for everybody. Democracy is not something simply people talk about. I have heard, for example, some leaders boasting that I brought you democracy, as if in fact they had it in their pocket, you know, or on their bank account and all that kind of stuff. No, democracy is not that. Democracy is something that happens in a situation where people are free, where people are free to choose who should be their leaders. And in fact, in a democracy, it is the people that are the bosses, not the people who represent them.
Can you give an example of the leaders and the rulers?
Well, it's very, very simple, to be very honest with you. I think that I can look, for example, at South African President Cyril Ramaphosa as someone that fits the definition of a leader.
But he's new, he just came in.
It doesn't matter whether he's new. It is not about the individual now in a democracy, it's about the process. The process allows things to happen. But in a non-democratic environment, and that is where the majority of what you call African leaders actually fall. These are individual authorities, beginning with a person like Theodore Obiang, who has actually been in office again since 1978, after, interestingly, he actually seized power in a military coup, and his own uncle was actually hanged simply because, at least according to then young Theodore Obiang, this man was a dictator. This man was undemocratic, and so he wanted to impose democracy. So when you talk about leaders, really, you don't have many. You have a man like Ian Khama, who just left office in Gaborone, in Botswana. The last time I interviewed him, he said, he suggested I should actually call him Seretse Khama, Ian Khama. Seretse Khama having been the founding president of Botswana and happens to be the father of Ian Khama. You can actually call Khama a leader. You can call, for example, John Dramani Mahama, who used to be president in the Republic of Ghana, lost an election, conceded defeat with grace, handed over power to his political opponent, Nana Akufo-Addo. And so you can see that context.
So it's good luck, Jonathan.
You can talk about Goodluck Jonathan. He accepted the will of the people. You can talk about Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, who was president for Liberia, and of course he has just won the Mo Ibrahim Prize to boot. He received it in the Rwandan capital, Kigali. I don't know what that means symbolically, because frankly, let's face it, the last time I checked, I do not think that you can even talk about a nascent type of democracy in the Republic of Rwanda. There are other things happening. Some of them are good, like a clean city, but the clean city for who? And but when you talk about democracy, no. Then you talk about rulers.
So does that mean that, for example, the Mo Ibrahim Foundation's mission statement has changed? The fact that they're looking at Rwanda, even hosting their event in Rwanda, a country that is quote-unquote considered undemocratic?
I don't think that their mission has changed. At least I haven't heard it from them. But I think maybe it was a question of who decided to host it and probably how much money that person put on the table. Who knows? It could also be something that involves public relations and what have you. It could also be, on the other hand, that, look, this is somebody who obviously does not embrace or reflect what you call democracy. But if we actually hold something democratic in that capital, we'll probably have some kind of unusual influence. Just like, you know, you talk about certain things happen via osmosis, you know? I remember, of course, when former Liberian President Johnson was receiving the award, he challenged the African leaders sincerely who do not want to leave power. He said, let's face it, there's nothing just like a society being static, because all societies are dynamic. And as they are dynamic, they are young people who are growing up, have different ideas, are not invested in the status quo and what have you. They will need change. And so she appealed to them, in fact, to think about leaving office when they still have time, rather than creating conditions where some people can be forced to leave office.
Speaking about leaving office, I think one of your fans here in Zambia talks about you actually getting into office. The last time we were in Zambia, were together in Zambia, you had this huge following of young people following you around. And this one wants to know, his name is Hastings Mushisha in Zambia. He says, Shaka, come and become our president. What do you think, Shaka? Is that something that you can do for the people of Zambia?
I have to say, of course, to Hastings that I am profoundly flattered and humbled that he comes up with such an idea. But again, I am not surprised, at least, given the history of the Republic of Zambia, because you know as well as I do that I happen to be a sort of close almost disciple in terms of democracy as far as Kenneth Kaunda is concerned, the founding president of Zambia. You remember I told him that one thing I admired about him and his brother, Mwalimu Julius Kambarage Nyerere of Tanzania, and people like Kwame Nkrumah and what have you, when they were trying to liberate the rest of their cousins across the African continent, they seemed to have no boundaries, no borders in their minds. They seemed to have an Africa that existed before 1884-85, when at Berlin, the Berlin Conference, a German chancellor, Bismarck, convened a conference attended by many European powers and non-powers to look at Africa as a piece of cake and divide it among themselves. And so I think that when you think about it, the Europeans were able to do that because there is a saying, Paul, that all of life is action and passion. And to ignore the action and the passion of your time or generation is to risk having not really lived at all. So those Dr. David Livingstones, Henry Morton Stanley, all those Speke and Baker, Blazer and you name it, who were explorers and sometimes wrongly referred to as discoverers, because you couldn't possibly discover something where there were already human beings and stuff like that and interacting. But I think if that gentleman wants this, this kind of, his answer to be answered, because given the way countries now, since then, are structured and what have you, I would almost find myself eminently underqualified, not only to be president of Zambia, but probably to be even president, in fact, of Uganda, and yet I happen to have been born in Kabale, southwestern Uganda. So I would say that he needs, first of all, to create a movement that brings about fundamental constitutional changes so that we can remove these artificial boundaries and borders which really belong to Europeans, not the Africans. If that were to happen, it's something probably I would think about. But right now, it doesn't look good.
Well, under those circumstances, you don't have to worry about you getting a visa next time you travel to Zambia. What are you talking about tomorrow on Straight Talk Africa?
Tomorrow we'll be looking, of course, at the significance of Nigerian President Muhammadu Buhari's trip to Washington. And so we'll obviously look again at the dynamics between President Buhari and U.S. President Donald Trump, in terms of how I said earlier that they seemed sincerely to develop a sort of chemistry.
We still have time for maybe one more comment. Let's go to Frank Nwamanya in Uganda. What accomplishments can Africa and pride itself for in the last 2 decades?
Well, first of all, I would say that there have been more universities, generally, really, on the African continent. And I say that because when you look at East Africa, for example, for many years, they used to have only one university in East Africa, which also was, by the way, not a university really, because in fact, it happened to be a constituent college of London University. And I'm talking about your alma mater, Makerere. But since then, you had so many universities come up, not only in East Africa, but on the entire continent. So because of that, you could say that there have been so many university graduates across the continent. There are a lot of incredible things, frankly, that have been developed by individuals and what have you, not necessarily governments. You could say that there are probably more roads in a lot of African countries. So the infrastructure probably has increased. The only problem is that democracy, frankly, is still missing in action.
Shaka, on that note, I'm being told that we've run out of time. Thank you so much. I look forward to hosting you in another edition of Shaka Extra Time. Until then, so long from Washington.